Welcome everyone to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations, a webinar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice. I'm Professor Mary Christianakis, and I'm joined today with by my co-host, Professor Mora. And we are just so pleased to have Martha and Quetzal here with us. First, a bit about the series. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists. This fall series, in collaboration with the California Immigration Semester, which is Professor Mora and me at this point, we are hosting a series of just focused on immigration. You can register for upcoming events and access our YouTube channel, where you can watch a video of past events at oxy.edu/matrix. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at CTSJ Oxy for both. Tomorrow, October 15th, at noon, we will be hosting Alice Bagg, the legendary punk rock activist extraordinaire. Yay! Professor Mora of the Sociology Department will introduce our wonderful guest for today's webinar.
Hi, everyone. Quetzal Flores is a Grammy Award-winning Chicana musician, producer, and culture strategist organizer raised in East Los Angeles. He is the founder and musical director of the Grammy Award-winning Chicano band Quetzal. As a producer, Quetzal has contributed over 100 recordings with artists such as Son de Madera, Nobuku Miyamoto, B-Side Players, Alice Bagg, Maya Jupiter, and Aloe Black. As a songwriter, he has contributed over 100 compositions and has established a unique and influential voice that has impacted younger artists such as La Santa Cecilia. From 2013 to 2019, he served as a board member for the Smithsonian Folkways Recorders. Since 2012, Quetzal has served as a program manager for the Alliance for California Traditional Arts. Born and raised in Boyle Heights, Martha Gonzalez is a Chicana artivista, an artist activist, musician, feminist, music theorist, and associate professor in the Intercollegiate Department of Chicana and Latina Studies at Scripps Claremont College. She is the author of the new book, Chicana Activistas, Music, Community, and Transborder Tactics in East Los Angeles. She has been a Fulbright, a Ford, and a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. Her academic interests have been fueled by her own musicianship as a singer, songwriter, and percussionist for the Grammy Award-winning band Quetzal. A testament to her body of music and community work, Gonzalez has accomplished on and off the stage. In the summer of 2017, Gonzalez Tarima, her stompbox, and Zapateado dance shoes were acquired by the National Museum of American History. The relevance of the band Quetzal's music and lyrics has been noted in a range of publications, from dissertations to scholarly books. Their latest recording, Puentes Sonoros, Sonic Bridges, will be released on Smithsonian Folkways later this fall. Together, Flores and Gonzalez have been instrumental in catalyzing the transnational dialogue between Chicanas Latinas communities in the US and Jarocho communities in Veracruz, Mexico. They have also taught songwriting in correctional facilities throughout California. Flores and Gonzalez live in Los Angeles with their 15-year-old son, Sandino. Please welcome Flores and Gonzalez.
Thank you, Professor Mora. So I'd like to start talking about Chicano music, because this is our practice. This is the tradition that we come from. And in order to understand Chicano music, one must understand the history of the Southwest, the history of Los Angeles in particular. And I'd like to start with a quick story about migration. And that is of a woman who was born into slavery. Her name was Biddy Mason, and who was then sold to a family that converted to Mormonism. This is in Mississippi. That family left Mississippi to go to Utah to be closer to the Mormon church and whatnot. And so with them, they took their property, or what they perceived as their property, which included Biddy Mason, who walked from Mississippi to Utah behind the carriage. And then this guy's name was Robert Smith, and he then took his mission to California. What he didn't really understand was that California had grandfathered in the anti-slave laws from the time when it was Mexico, and so California was considered a quote unquote free state. And Biddy Mason, arriving in California, also walking behind the carriage from Utah to California, she heard about this thing that you could do. You could petition for your freedom after a certain amount of time. There's a statute of limitation you can have to bring slaves into this state without this legally, keeping them. And so she petitioned for her freedom. He stayed longer than the whatever the statute of limitation was. She won her freedom. Then she became, she was already a midwife she was a generational midwife. Then she became a nurse, saved lots of money, bought lots of property in downtown. What is Little Tokyo now was mostly the property that Biddy Mason owned. She was an influential figure. She created some of the first semblances of like food kitchens and homeless shelters, et cetera. And her philosophy was the house of the open hand, right? And so the reason I bring this up is because the stories of migration we've been told have often been, this narrative of, looking for a better life, et cetera. But oftentimes migration is forced. And there's a quote somewhere that says, people don't leave their place of origin and embark upon this dangerous, life-threatening, treacherous journey unless the place that they are leaving from is more dangerous than that journey, right? And this is oftentimes what's happening within immigration and migration. And so the story that's not told is how powerful the contributions of these people are to our communities. And in particular, I want to talk about Boyle Heights today. And as a matter of fact, Biddy Mason is buried in Boyle Heights at Evergreen Cemetery. And this is an important point because Boyle Heights has since the beginning been a sanctuary for immigrants, for people migrating, looking for a safe place to land, an affordable place to land, etc. And so historically, it's been that for Japanese Americans, for Jewish folks, for Mexican and other folks from Central and Latin America, Russian people, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on. And there's these wonderful stories and narratives of cooperation between these people in this community, understanding that in order for them to be able to thrive in the face of everything that they're going through, that there has to be cooperation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in Boyle Heights, particularly around an organization that I just started called the Community Power Collective. And before we do that, though, we're going to go into a song about migration. This is called Pillow People. Sorry. These instruments also come to us from a wonderful story of migration.
All right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Over mountains, over cerros, over desert valleys,
From the ranchos to the towns to the city alleys, coming ones, coming twos, Texas, Utah, Cali. People walking, running, calling border tallies. Men, boys, women, girls, young, old, skinny, fatty. Hold their elders, hold their hopes, hold their little babies. No food, no means, no way to have it. Run, stumble, fall, get back up and at it. Walk it, run it, under moon, under radar, make the dash and run it. Touching down into town, washing, working, mowing, taking heed, feeling need, sending line, not knowing that you need, filled by greed, present, sowing. All the ties, U.S. ties, go and tell and growing. The more they come, build, challenge states of law and knowing what is seen, what it's moving, there is no destroying. And if you've heard the story, you know more pain than glory. Oh, pillow people. Oh, pillow people. Oh, pillow people. On the bestia drifting, milagros, santos, michos, luck, elder persinadas, a safe return, a miracle, new peregrinada. The oracle said miracle, yeah. History at its pinnacle, yeah. Oracle said miracle, yeah. Dreaming is a pinnacle, yeah. And if you've heard the story, you know more pain than glory.
Puro ruido acá. So yeah, so the practice, very quickly, just the practice of Chicano music is exactly that, is having the privilege in a lot of ways to be able to grow up Mexican in this place in Los Angeles in the Southwest, and have this very close dynamic with the Black community, for example, and being influenced by Black music heavily, growing up with it, understanding it, like viscerally feeling the pain and triumph of the Black community, and identifying with it absolutely. And so a lot of Chicano music is exactly that. We're playing these traditional instruments from Veracruz that are also from a Afro-diasporic tradition known as the son jarocho, which some of you may have taken a class at Oxy with Cesar Castro, who's the teacher there. But so, and then be able to sing in English and have these English lyrics and this English or this American pop sensibility, etc. So that's all part of Chicano music, and also a large part of being the beneficiaries of immigrant knowledge, collective knowledge and experience. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing in Boyle Heights with the Community Power Collective, as I mentioned previously. And so the way that I talk about my work is around propagating cultural power. And so the mission of Community Power Collective is to build power with low-income tenants and workers through transformative cross-sectoral organizing, win economic justice, community control of land and housing, and to propagate systems of cooperation in Boyle Heights, East LA, and Greater Los Angeles. And so what you don't hear in there is, or explicitly, is that this is about the immigrant experience, and also about, and not just the immigrant experience as in, people that are migrating from Mexico and Latin America, but there was a huge migration of Black people across to the West at some point during Jim Crow. And so there's also that, and understanding the dynamic there, and then understanding how this country has created wars internally and externally, and that how that has created a huge influx of different cultures and communities that have absolutely influenced the way that Los Angeles feels and looks, and has made it so much richer, right? And so the vision for us is we enact a world where land, housing, food, and work are human rights facilitated through local systems of cooperation and solidarity in the greater Los Angeles area. I would add education to that. So it's really about taking the traditional knowledge that is brought to these places by people of color, by people who have migrated from different places, and lifting it up to find solutions to our own problems, right? And being able to enter into spirals of regeneration versus these cycles of resistance, which currently I feel like our theory of change includes this idea that we've been fixed into this cycle of resistance, and this is the only way for us to currently exist with dignity, is to resist, right? And so I'm offering that potentially there is another way, and that is that we can not only imagine a world that we want, we can actually begin to enact it in these very tangible ways. And by enacting these ideas that are rooted in the connection of all things, not just centering humanity, but centering all things, and in that being able to do what Bell Hooks says is de-self-actualizing, or undoing what we have become to instead become human as process. Okay, so since colonization, traditional practices of Black and Indigenous people have been under constant attack, colonial forces attack traditional practices, intentionally attack traditional practices, languages, religious practices to uproot humanity as a process and maintain systems of oppression. The pervasiveness of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy continues to remind our communities that in order to be relevant, one must submit to its product-driven will. Working people of color have tremendous history of refusing unlivable destinies and proposing alternatives. And we lead with the understanding that art and culture are inseparable and symbiotic resources that live at the essence of community vitality and transformation. And that's really important because, you know, we live in this society that hyper compartmentalizes everything, right? And art has been extracted from the idea of culture. And we understand from our community that, in fact, these things are not separated. Just like dance and music are not separate things, art and culture are not separate things. They're maybe components, right? Or there's slight differences between them, but they certainly exist in a symbiotic relationship. And so, I want to make sure that I'm making that clear. And so, you know, again, I'm talking about Boyle Heights, and I'm talking about, you know, this historic sanctuary neighborhood, and also a redlined neighborhood where only one of the only places where Black and Latino and Asian people could exist, or immigrant people could exist, Jewish people included in that. And so, you know, you have this wealth of information, this wealth of cultural power, of understanding, of exchange, of cooperation. And so, so then we provoke those sort of convening practices, as we're calling them, cultural convening practices, as sites of the facilitation of power and cooperation. That's to say that when we're looking at the way that communities are able to support one another and cooperate, that embedded in those practices are systems that can then be lifted up and proliferated in really important ways to create a future that is founded and sustainable in the practices, the very practices that are being enacted, right? And so, and within those practices, it's always, culture is at the center of those practices, right? So fluidly embedding arts and culture as a daily organizational institutional practice, a way of being, lifting up arts and culture as viable resources to meet needs. We talked about that earlier. Use arts and cultural lens and practices to create new criteria for human development. Something that happens when we're talking about culture and cultural practices is that people's imaginations are just taken somewhere else. I was working with a bunch of high school students at Roosevelt, and I asked them, you know, hey, so like, what do you value culturally in this community? And at first, you know, the question was like, what are you talking about? And then I gave some examples, and then one student raises their hand and they say, do you mean like the curandera, which is the healer, right? And I was like, yeah, tell me about the curandera. And he says, well, you know, she te saca el chamuco, which means like she she gets rid of the devil inside you, right? Or the devils inside you. And so it's like a, you know, spiritual and faith healer, but also in like dealing with herbs and all these other traditional ways of being, right? And I was like, absolutely. And so then this student wrote this whole piece on the curandera. And so it's less about, you know, my personal aesthetic and criteria and understanding and definition of what is valuable in a community, and more about what the community values themselves, and then taking that system of values and then creating actionable items behind that, right? And so one of the things we do is we identify these cultural practice and the cultural bearers in the community. We critically analyze current or cultural practices to identify the systems that lie within. This is about controlling a narrative and imagining new narratives that we can tell as collective narratives. It's also about a shift from rules to agreements, right? Or acuerdos, the way we say in Spanish. And the question is always like, what's the difference between a rule and an agreement, right? And what's the difference between punishment and consequences? What's the difference between, sympathy and empathy? And like going into these critical questions that we can really draw the answers out collectively from our cultural practices. And this is part of that interrogation, of that deep critical analysis, right? And then finally, the convivio as a method for weaving the social fabric. And so this is the way that ways that communities come together, especially immigrant communities come together. And I remember, just kind of having conversations about economic sustainability and the idea of recycling money and how embedded that is in some of the communities. And I have a very close Vietnamese friend who her uncle went out and bought a car from the dealer without telling the family. And he came back with a car and the family was like, "What is that?" And he's like, "Oh, it's the car I just bought." They're like, "Where did you get it?" He said, "From the dealer." Where did the loan come from? "Oh, I just got the loan from the dealer." And they're like, "Take it back." And so they made him take the car back. And then he came back home and then they gave him the money to go buy the car again. And they're like, "This is how we do it," right? And so there's all this information that crosses all these different sectors. It's not just about, feel-good cultural practice. This is we're talking about economic justice. We're talking about spiritual justice. We're talking about mind, body, spirit balance and wellness. We're talking about, gender justice within those practices as well. And so, and really, anyways, so you get what I'm getting at. So I'm just going to go to this one. So what would it look like when we win, right? We're building a world entrenched in systems of cooperation, community land trusts, cooperative housing, and small businesses operate in solidarity to support these human rights that are controlled by local, autonomous, interconnected communities. Art and culture is critical to ensure that many generations forward, this remains a way of life, right? And so what I'm saying there is that besides from all the fancy stuff at the top and this utopia that we're building, I'm talking about like the need for art and culture to fluidly be a part of an essential piece to the exercising, to building that muscle. That's where it's the vehicle that then creates the constant exercise and repetition. That's what art and culture is for us. So I think we're going to go into another song and then we can maybe take some questions.
I just want to underscore something that you mentioned earlier, and this idea that art and culture, going back to the cycle, rather than perpetually being in the cycle of resistance, to think about how art and culture is not resistant, right? That art and culture, especially in its most democratic practice, and if we're really observing convivencia or el convivio, right, of art and culture, and when we say art and culture, we're not meaning it, or Quetzal doesn't mean it as a product, right? Something you buy or sell. This is a way of being in community, and that in and of itself escapes. When you think of it that way, you not only marginalize capital and the way it has led us to understand art and culture over so many years, and especially with the industrialization of art and culture, right? But also it helps us escape from that arrangement, that social arrangement, and it allows us to go to a place that is generative, right? That art and culture will give you energy, will generate energy, hope, and that's also important to recognize.
So we're going to play a son. This is a traditional piece from Veracruz, Mexico. And for Chicanos, the son jarocho is incredibly important and has played a part in us being able to articulate our lived reality. And I'll tell a quick story before we play this. But so in the 50s, there was this young man named Richie Valens, Ricardo Valenzuela, later, his artist name Richie Valens, who was the son of migrant workers, and who eventually had a recording contract, had some success, and then decided to record a Mexican tune in a rock and roll format, and he created La Bamba as an interpretation of a traditional song. And in this act, and I call it like a radical act of affirmation and love, because what he did was to affirm his position, his narrative in music. And for me, what it did was, in one act, he created the possibility of articulating our lived realities through sound. And so since that time, that's part of the Chicano music tradition. That's a really important point in the Chicano music tradition. And we're not talking about just like a regular moment. This is a moment where you still have it documented in the history of California. You have that people were being hanged, immigrants were being hanged, and persecuted in deep ways. This was during Operation Wetback, right? This is a government-sponsored hate campaign against immigrants, much like today. And so the son jarocho itself has been a source of power and a voice for Chicanos for many generations. Los Lobos have used it. We use it. La Santa Cecilia uses it. Oso Motley uses it. All these incredible artists that have come out of Boyle Heights and East LA are using this music in part to articulate their lived reality. So we're going to honor this tradition and the folks who we have relationships with in Veracruz, who have given us so much and who continue to be in dialogue with us. And so we're going to, and these instruments have, along with people, sounds and instruments migrate, And so these instruments crossed borders, quote unquote, illegally, right? Like, they were sold here. Nobody has to know about it. Now people are gonna know about it because it's on the recording, but, the makers themselves, it's a way of the informal economy continuing to emerge. And so we're gonna play a song. So that was La Guacamaya. Looks like we have a question in our
Which is
box.
really the macabre.
What are some of the agreements that are important to make? Well, that's an excellent question, and the way that the process is acted out is that these questions are placed in a community setting, in a collective space. It's not for an individual to decide what those agreements are. It's process. This is all process-based engagement, right? And so I would bring that question to the community and be even more specific, So take a step back and say, again, what is valuable culturally to you? And in one of the spaces, I remember some of the responses were like, respect for elders. The elders get thrown away here, right? And I was like, all right, that's a really important thing to hear and to listen to, right? And so our response to that eventual agreement that we are going to consider elders was to then engage elders in a conversation around what they want to do. And one of the things they talked about was growing food, for example. Like, we know how to grow food, and we may be old, but we have this knowledge, and it's like perfect. And so then how do you build a process and then programs that can support this desire for community elders to continue to participate in their community and give this very rich and essential resource to community, right? Richard, you were going to come back on?
Yeah.
Sorry, Professor Mota.
Yeah, I have a question for Martha, and then we'll circle back to some of the work you do, Quetzal. Martha, I know that amongst some things that you've written about the idea of sort of mixing and remixing in the kitchen. Right? And so this idea of women and mothers coming together through music and building community that way. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So that really is directly related to the relationship, the transnational relationship or translocal relationship we've had with, as Chicanos and Latinos here in the U.S. have had with Son Jarocho communities in Veracruz, and in the general, the fandango and the Son Jarochos being played all over the Mexican nation state. So there are a number of women that have been instrumental in not just influencing and organizing around the fandango and bringing their communities together. Unfortunately, they haven't had, the luxury of traveling because they're taking care of family. And so oftentimes when these groups or these maestros come to Veracruz, because they're being supported by communities here on a grassroots level, the wives stay home, right? So that work was really an effort to elevate the voices of the women in the movement, and the women, their ideas, their expressions, the things that were important to them, through music, right? And oftentimes through individual and collaborative, collective songwriting processes, right? Some of which oftentimes we utilize, Quetzal utilizes for CPC Collective in all of these different ways. That's part of our cultural, sort of legacy that we have here as Chicanos and Mexicanos, which actually that method itself was really informed by our relationship with the Zapatista movement, right? That's the first time we'd ever done it in a 1997 encuentro. But I'm verging from the main point, and that is the idea here is that, we're using this tool of music, again, right, to instigate dialogue, right? And it's through the music, through the convivios, right, in music, that we were able to sort of draw out all of these ideas that ended up becoming Entre Mujeres, And I invite everybody to sort of watch a short documentary. It's 20 minutes if you ever have a chance to watch it. It's called Con Tanta Luz en la Voz. And it's actually up on YouTube now. And it really shows what ends up happening with all of these songs, right? And most of it happened because we have portable recording equipment like we do here today. most of it happened, in the spaces that were made them comfortable, right? We had a very small house. Most of the time we wrote in the kitchen or in the kitchen table. And so the article you're referring to was sort of a play on words. Mixing happens in an actual recording studio, right? But we talk about it as mixing in the kitchen. And in this case, we're mixing sound, right? We're recording, we're creating these songs using portable recording equipment, of course, having it always present during these convivios and these dialogues that we felt were important to capture for posterity and just for the sake of theorizing and being together in and with music.
Also mixing cultures and relationships.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Thank you. Quetzal, if I can circle back to you, and this will expand a little bit on the notion on your visit with the Zapatistas. What you presented, right? So that the notion of regeneration reminds me of the idea of the caracol, right? That's very much sort of central to some of the philosophy that the Zapatistas put forth. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So that actually, that piece came from a year-long mural project with an organization that I was working with at the time, that I was specifically hired to bring in these processes to this organization as a way of transforming the DNA of the organization that had become this very sort of static and confined nonprofit organization. And the director at the time had this vision and had been working with me in different spaces and was like, I want to bring this to the organization and I want to just break apart these silos and create a system of interconnectedness, right? As a way to, because the other thing she was seeing was that, yeah, like our numbers look really good. Like the organization is quote unquote financially stable and blah, blah, blah. But we look outside and the community is getting worse and gentrification is looming. And, like politicians continue to prey on these communities. Corporations continue to prey on these communities. We're not really building what we intend to build. And instead we're implicit in perpetuating harms against this community. And so how do we then bring in cultural practice to be able to inform these shifts, these important shifts, and the need to build a collective vision within an organization that emerges from everyone's experiences. And so that specific thing is from that mural project that we did with Omar Ramirez, who also was at the Encuentro, and who he and I have been in close communication and in work together, and our formation is that moment in LA in the Zapatista movement, and a lot of the ways in which that helped us to break out of the binary, all right? And at the time, much of the binary was surrounding capitalism, socialism, and so on and so forth. So for us, like a lot of this work is a continuum. It's not necessarily one moment or one influence, but a continuation of this need to do exactly what that quote from Bell Hooks that I said, which is to de-self-actualize and to remove our investment in white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And how do we do that? What are the things that are outside of this experience, that continue to thrive outside this experience? And I always talk about, like, one of the things is the tamalada. If anyone's ever been to a tamalada, it's a tamal making party, right? And there is so much that's being enacted in this moment, right? This is the place where not only did I receive information on how you make this delicious food that stems, like, it goes way back. It's rooted in indigenous history, this is pre-colonial stuff, right? And so how did that travel through space and time to arrive in my hands through my grandmother and my aunties in a circle, making this, and then what was enacted in that space, like these deep connections to one another and understandings of who we are as people, as family members, what the dynamics are, how to interact, how to have healthy conversations. And then there's learning about what, it's, you can call it chisme if you want to, right? But it is what is learning stories, learning histories, learning about people in the family that maybe I didn't know about, or things that I didn't know about them exactly. This is all enacted in this one space of the tamal making party, the tamalada. And even everybody has a role to play, right? And me as a child, whether I was soaking the corn husks and getting my hands on this very important food to our people, to actually, like I said, being in community with my grandmother and my aunties. And so these are the types of things that we look for in order to catapult us into regenerative process, right? And regenerative process is not cyclical. It's spirals, like the caracol. You mentioned the caracol. And that's the whole idea behind the Zapatistas. They were like, wait a minute, like at their first moment of transition, they named their communities Aguascalientes, right? That was their declaration, and the reference is that they're Zapatistas, right? And they're following in the line of Zapata, the radical revolutionary in Mexico, indigenous radical revolutionary in Mexico. And the indigenous accords that were signed during the Mexican Revolution were signed in Aguascalientes. And so that's the reference and why they called their communities Aguascalientes. And then they understood that there was more to it, and that it was still within the confines of colonial thought. And so then they said, no, we're indigenous. And for us, this is a continual process. And we have to be able to think about it in that way. And the other thing that you can bring into this is the 7 generations, right? Indigenous people think 7 generations forward. It's not about me. It's like, what am I going to leave in 7 generations? Look at these mega fires. Look at this pandemic. Like we're implicit in giving future generations an unlivable earth, right? Or an unsustainable earth for human beings, at least, and animals, right? Because the earth is going to repair itself. The earth is going to, it's going to burn, and tsunamis, and we're insignificant at some point. And so we have to be able to think in line with not just humanity, but with the entire universe, right? And this is the indigenous cosmovision. This is the beauty of how indigenous people have contributed to the world, and still this information is available. And so,
Martha, Quetzal, I just want to invite the students who are on here and the faculty and our guests to go ahead and use the Q&A to type in questions. And while you do that, I want to link. So I know our students, this is part of our CSP class. We're going to just continue on into the CTSJ 105, the education aspect of the class. For those of you who are guests, you're welcome to stay. We're going to go just a little bit over time to give people time to ask questions and to link to our content for the class today in CTSJ 105. We are, just for Martha and Quetzal, we are studying language shift and language loss in Latino communities here in California, and the ways in which we have to have regeneration of language, revival of languages, and the ways in which heritage languages are constantly being sort of revived and revised to address the current situations, right? The current, the particular moments. I'm wondering, what are the areas where you think we need regeneration in California specifically? I don't want to go national because I think we're here, right? And this is what we know, but what other areas do you think we could turn our attention to or our focus?
When I think about how in the 50s, there were, people that would get, physically punished for speaking Spanish, and out of self-preservation, right? They make it a point to not teach their children Spanish, for example, Spanish. I don't really, and then so this new generation doesn't speak Spanish, and so what gets lost in the purview is, yes, a language, but more importantly, a sensibility, right? I think language is tied to sensibility, worldview that is packed with some of the things that Quetzal talked about earlier, right? These words, the convivio, for example, convivencia, to live with, enclose, be present spiritually, physically, not just physically, right? But in all of these ways, I think that these words, we say convivencia or convivio because there's no other word in the English language that really fits that, right? And in that sense, I think language is important in order to be able to transmit these ideas, right? These ways of being in community. And I think first of all, I don't have the solution, but I would think that it'd be great to sort of group different people together that have different experiences with language, right? But more importantly, for us to develop, let's say, that we agree on language, right? And we say, okay, we're all speaking English, or there has to be always an attention to language equity, right? Like language justice, right? Definitely. And for these people, we have the capacity now to translate back and forth to ideologies and ways of being and systems of belief through these new technologies that we have, right? I think that would be really important to do. And to just remember that it's not, for me, it's not so much language, because I think about those people in the 50s. It is, but it's also something that I think we need to be able to transmit a way of being, and that can be done through action, right? And again, harnessing some of these technologies, but it's not an answer as much as it is, sort of recognizing what the important work that language does for us as people and in relationships and worldviews. I don't know.
We have a question from the audience. What are the ways that we can form community within our own networks, like our own families? What might that look like?
Yeah, my question to that would be, well, what does your family do? Like, how do you guys hang out? Right? And then from there, what is enacted when you hang out? Like, when does it feel good when you're hanging out? And why? And where does that come from? Like, is this something that was passed down? Like dancing in the living room, for example. That's a thing, right? And so yeah, like I feel good when my family dances in the living room. Okay. And then you got to wonder, like, okay, who initiated that? Oh, my mom, she used to dance with us when we were kids, and it just never ended, right? Okay. Dance parties in the living room. And then, where did she learn that from? Oh, her auntie so-and-so used to, et cetera, et cetera, And so that's like, it's always about the questions, the right questions to ask, and less about, me as some, anointed expert giving answers about, these models that then can be repeated over and over and over. It's more about like the questions that can be continually asked, and each community, each family must go through a process of answering them together. Mm-hmm. And that could be, a really incredible bonding experience in and of itself.
I think it can also be, we need to also recognize that over the course of time, like my mom was an orphan, in Tijuana, and her mother died early on. So there weren't really any traditions beyond survival, right? And the migration that happened, and, her not having a real family and what she imagined a family to be, to have all of these different circumstances that come up in her life that it took her a long time to sort of establish a culture, or for her to take control beyond an abusive man and marriage or whatever, you know, TMI. But the whole point is that she had to establish a certain way of being with our family and her kids. And now we're at a generation where we're asking ourselves these things like, what do we want? What do we want for our family? Some of it, you could reach back the way Quetzal said and ask these questions in these moments. And sometimes we have to even say to ourselves, you know what? This is a part of our culture that we don't want, you know? We don't want abusive people in the family. We want to shut that down in our own ways or the way we can, or have a dialogue around it, right? We want to change this, that, and the other, right? This is the good part. We want to keep this. We want to. So I think that's also a part of that process as well. I just want to recognize that not every family comes with all this, loaded with all of this. We don't know how to make tamales, you know. I wish we did, and that would be a great thing for us to learn and like together, right? And establish that so that future generations can do the same.
I do.
So I don't think he does. Actually, he does. He does know how to make tamales.
I do.
They're pretty good. Yeah.
We have another question in the Q&A. Why has it been important for you to create music in English and Spanish and not just stick to one language?
Yeah, this
Or
goes.
Spanglish.
Yeah, this goes back to the idea that Martha was talking about, right? Of like the importance of nuance, the importance of cultural understanding, cultural sustainability, context, etc. Sometimes there are words that don't have the same meaning when you translate them, and so it's important for us to be able to have those conversations, and the whole language justice movement that is around today is all about people speaking the language that they feel comfortable in, as a way of not centering English in a space, and then anybody who doesn't speak English gets translation, right? Mm-hmm. No, it's like if there is someone who speaks Vietnamese, someone who speaks Hmong, someone who speaks Spanish, and then someone who speaks English in a space, then you would have an interpreter for each of those people, because we're not going to center English in this space. So for us as Chicanos, it's very complicated because it's not just one language. It's like oftentimes a mix of both, because sometimes it is more expressive in English, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a question about convivencias, right? The notion of communities coming together and sort of creating together. You've done that with Nobuku Miyamoto, or you've done it with folks in the Japanese community. Can you talk a little bit about the work you've done that's crossed some of these lines that other folks might see, right, of separation between communities?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah.
Talk about
So yeah, like that's a great example. So Fandango and Obon in particular is a project where we saw an opportunity through the cultural convening practices, or the practices of convivio. For us, it's the fandango. It's this tradition that comes from Veracruz, where it's essentially a ritual gathering through the son jarocho music, where community realizes itself in a temporal fashion, and then it dissipates, and then it comes back again. But in what's enacted in those spaces is really critical relationships and new ideas and problems that are dealt with and faced. And anyways, there's all this stuff that's enacted. But the whole point is that each traditional community has one of these, right? And for the Japanese American community, it's obon. And oftentimes these things are found in circles. More of a contemporary version of this is the hip hop cipher, right? Still a circle, right? Still only participants. Even if you're just there watching, you're actively witnessing and willing this into fruition, right? And a part of a community. And so we thought, wow, let's bring some of these practices together from the different communities, or from three different communities: African American community, Chicano Latino community, and then Japanese American community. And let's begin to use this as a platform to reconnect these bases to one another, and to begin to potentially organize, and heal those fractures that were systematically created, post 68, let's say. And so that this is one of the things that we do.
And part of that, I think, is to recognize between Obon and Fandango is that it's intergenerational, participatory, transgenerational, right? So you can have a little baby, nursing baby, and a grandma participating, right? Anything in between. And part of what this has led us to is, first of all, some of the discussions that have happened in that sort of spiral or catapult into other efforts such as environmental justice, right? There's discussion in and around environmental justice. There's discussion around the relationship between, Japanese internment and women and children in cages on the border, right? There's ongoing collaboration. So Fandango Obon has given root and energy to all these other efforts, right? And when we celebrate together, which happens once a year, and actually there's the events are going on right now. When this happens, it's generative, but it's also helping us summit into new forms of analysis, right? Connecting our ancestral histories, our ways in which we have been, our communities have been challenged, but also the ways in which we have thrived, right?
Another question in the queue. How is your community imagining new narratives, and what inspires those?
Yeah, so for example, the work with street vendors, okay, and going from, this narrative that was handed down that was like, okay, these are people who are dirty, who are doing something illegal, who
immigrants.
Yeah, they're immigrants, blah 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 blah, right? Okay, and then so this new narrative that they themselves have developed through their struggle is, no, these are micro entrepreneurs, these are culture bearers of tradition, deep tradition, and these are people who are have found solutions, their own solutions to an impossible economic situation, right? And who,
And they provide affordable, healthy food, like the frutero.
Yeah, and this is how it continues to spiral, for example, okay? I know a street vendor who has put 2 children through college, okay? So when I'm thinking about economy or economists, I don't want to hear the idiot who's talking about free market capitalism, because that hasn't done what it theoretically is supposed to do, or maybe it has,
No.
which is prey on people. I want the economist street vendor who has put 2 kids through college on that salary, on the amount of money that they're making. That's a genius right there. And so how do we lift that up and study and ask the right questions to understand how this person has thrived in the face of this impossible situation, right? And so this is how we continue to spiral these thoughts. It's not just about the feel-good cultural practice or cultural story. It's about impact, and it's also about, making sure that we're not compartmentalizing things, because it's all part of one experience, right? And so that's one idea in how narratives begin to shift, right?
Martha, I was wondering if the organization that you talked about in your PowerPoint, some of our students are going to leave this class energized by the possibility for immigration and immigrants and culture and revival. And I'm wondering, is there a space for participation for them? How would one get involved in this movement, in this community, in Convivo, right? Tell us how they could, we have local California people in our class, LA people, so.
So I'll type the website in the chat and an email you can send an email to. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Quetzal will put down some of that information. As far as Fandango or Bon, you can go to if you want to participate in Fandango or Bon and some of those efforts, it is really spearheaded by Nobuko Miyamoto and her organization, Great Leap. If you go to greatleap.org, will you type in greatleap.org? I think it's .org, but just look up Great Leap. That's a cultural organization, and this has been so successful and it's such great work for them that they are really have dedicated Fandango Bon that's what they've done all year long. But through Great Leap, you can find other organizations on there like Nikkei Progressives, who is a Japanese American transgenerational organizing committee body that also does this work around supporting what's happening at the border and the children in cages. They're actively fighting to push back on that, having had the experience of being interned. And, the Fandango community is on Facebook. There's different things that you can look up, and anytime there's Fandango workshops. You can go to Jarocello for Fandango workshops. Again, he's also been a visiting professor at Oxy at your college. You could go on to Quetzal. Also, you can type in Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre. That is the community land trust organization that is really looking to get community and is working actively to take land off the speculative market and really trying to build a new culture around how we think about land. Exactly.
Yeah.
How
community
we think
control
about
of land.
And community really implementing community control of land and doing it in such a way that it outlives us, right? That it continues into the future so that we never have to face this moment again.
If I can ask you all one question, I think it's a really interesting period right now, right? With now that you have all this technology available, you hear of all these people who are thinking of themselves as brands. You have all these people who are, who like, oh, content, right? Create content, right? And so I think that's because that's happening. I think that that what you all are presenting becomes that much more important, right? I think that there's a way in which what gets lost is the power of art in transformation or change. You think about countries where they've had dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, and oftentimes the first people they go after are the musicians, the poets, because they're sort of the truth tellers. Do you find it at a period where there's in the current period that it becomes much more difficult sort of to be heard, I guess, when you're sort of competing with all this other with all the static?
Absolutely. Yes. It's sometimes it feels devastating and it's exhausting, right? And to see how these certain things are privileged in someone's life over something that can actually be transformative and restorative and transformative, right? I still don't know, how I feel about social media. I still don't know how I feel about all that business because I've seen the power of that direct relationship building that is necessary to rehumanize a space, and to actually step together, right? What it means to start from the beginning and not make decisions for somebody, and to have a culture of consent throughout a process, right? What it means to remove my personal aesthetic from a space and create a song in collective and really, understanding and valuing, and like all those things are important practices in again, in undoing this horrible last 500 years of humanity, and it's going to take a long time. And so I also, sorry, one last thing.
No.
I also sit with the understanding that I'm not going to see the end of this, and but that I'm sure as hell going to make sure that this is in motion by the time I'm gone, so that my son has something to continue.
And I would say that that is the most significant thing that we're going to do, that we have done, and that is how we have taught our son and what he sees on a daily, right? He vicariously and directly has learned from some of these processes and some of the communities that we're a part of, most definitely. Quetzal and I go back and forth about social media, because, and we have discussions all the time because, he's like, fuck social media, excuse me. I don't, that shit is just terrible. It's just performance. And I was like, yeah, but everything's performance. And, we go back and forth about that. And my point is that it is nevertheless really important to the youth now. And we have to have the conversations with youth, like all the college students that are listening right now. What can you do that can make TikTok a tool for you to like change shit up, right? Like how can you express these kinds of ideas through TikTok, right? There is something going on in TikTok, for example. I know because I watch my son. He watches stupid shit, but then there's also really cool things like the blackouts. Like, so for example, for Indigenous Peoples Day, like they all made a conscious effort, or TikTok made a conscious effort to sort of block out everything else so that the algorithm would jump to all things Indigenous, right? And you saw all these beautiful TikToks that you would normally get to see, right? And so those kinds of attentions, would be really great. I'm trying to figure out ways of using TikTok for my students. Like, all right, you guys, you have to do a TikTok that has to do with boom, 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 right? And so I think that we can't, as much as I don't like, the aspects of social media, I nevertheless can't ignore it, right? Because it's something that is a reality for so many people now. And especially in the pandemic, olvídate, like that's like, has been like how we live now, right? In many respects, because we can't do this, always this carnal, right? This embodied hanging out, right? So I'm just gonna say that we haven't found a way to really harness it just yet. But I think that those are the conversations we need to have. My
Great.
tip for today.
For TikTok dance.
I just want to tell everyone that we are going to stop the recording now. And I thank Martha and Quetzal so much for visiting and for sharing your knowledge and for inspiring us. This will be on the CTSJ website probably by the afternoon. And I just thank you all again. For the students who are in CSP, we're going to skip the 11 o'clock class. I'll see you Friday. Just keep up with the reading. Okay?